Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Sorry, one second. Okay, can everybody see that screen? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, thank you. All right, so today well, I guess I'll just introduce myself here. My name is Kevin Ray Robetz. I'm a lecturer in the Business Administration Department at Kobe Gakuin University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about interaction frequency and pedagogical outcomes, specifically in EFL courses that use digital games or video games as a part of the curriculum. So mainly what I'm interested in is whether or not how often students interact with games affects or is correlated with the outcomes of testing protocols that are used simultaneously with the game. So just give you a brief overview of the presentation before we dive right into it. First, I want to talk about the issue of transferability in digital game-based learning curricula. So in a lot of the research, there's the issue of transferability has been brought up time and time again. So this kind of means, you know, the skills that we learn while playing video games might not actually transfer to any meaningful or relevant context outside of the game. So while it's been very well established that video games can be very powerful learning machines in the sense that they can kind of teach you how to play the game while playing the game and kind of teach you how to become a better player while playing the game. This doesn't necessarily mean that those skills that you're learning in the game transfer to any kind of out-of-game context. So this is a really important issue for us as educators, specifically educators who use video games as an instructional medium, because we probably want our students to get better at some kind of skill that's unrelated to the game. And we don't want our students to just get better at playing that specific game. So this is an important issue. Then I'm going to be talking about the game mechanics of the game that I actually used in the study. That's namely the game Baba Is You. And Baba Is You is a puzzle game that uses English grammar and syntax. And I think this game is a really good candidate to maybe demonstrate some kind of transferability, and mainly because it represents English grammar and syntax in a very simplified way, and it gives the player the opportunity to kind of manipulate that grammar in real time. And so I was really interested in investigating whether or not, you know, this kind of puzzle mechanic had any kind of effect on the students or the players' ability to correctly answer word order questions and well, English language word order questions, obviously. And so whether or not there's any kind of transfer of skill there that's happening. And more specifically, I was really interested in looking at whether how often they interacted with these puzzles had any kind of correlation to their performance on these word order tests. And then we're going to be talking about, you know, the specific methods that I use to measure this kind of skill transfer. So namely the testing protocols that I used, and then whether or not there's any correlation to the interaction frequency on these tests. So how often the game, specifically the gaming procedures that I used, and we'll talk about how we did that gaming procedure. And then we'll wrap it all up, obviously, with a presentation of some of the findings that I have, and then a quick discussion about the implications of these findings. And then we should have a fair amount of time to have questions and maybe a discussion afterwards. So let's jump right into it then. So when we're using video games in educational contexts, it kind of helps to frame the discussion with the idea of purpose versus application. So namely, what a video game is designed to do versus how we as educators are using it in educational contexts. So a lot of the games that educators end up using aren't actually designed to be used as pedagogical interventions, but we are using them as pedagogical interventions. And so this is like a really important distinction that we have to kind of pay attention to. And, you know, one of the reasons that a lot of educators end up using commercial games mostly, is that there's just a wider selection of commercial games available. And so when we look at why this is the case, we can look at the industry on whole, and the video game industry is really, really big, right? It's worth more than the music and movie industries combined, than other entertainment industries. So it's a very massive industry. And so this commercial success of video games as an industry has really led to the creation of a wide array of genres and gameplay mechanics and different platforms and things. So the choice, the choices that we have available to us as educators are just so vast. And so it's really appealing to be able to use, commercial games in essentially any kind of context. So whatever you're teaching, there's probably a game that's related in some form to that kind of topic. And so it's a really appealing, appealing instructional medium to use. And moreover, they're pretty fun to play, right? So all of these commercial games are if a game is commercially successful, it's basically successful because it's entertaining to play. So most commercial games are designed around this entertainment principle. And just because a game is commercially successful or really entertaining to play doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have applications in educational context either. So a lot of the research has shown us that commercial games do have applications in things like language learning and physical and mental wellness, political science, and computer programming. Not that this is a comprehensive list by any means, but there's many different applications for many different types of video games. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's obviously a lot of games that aren't necessarily designed for commercial applications or for commercial purposes. And case in point, there are some games that are designed specifically for medical applications. For example, to help not students, but patients recover from Alzheimer's disease or from concussions, in fact. So not all games are designed for commercial purposes, but more or less, a lot of the games that the educators end up using in DGBL curricula are commercially or commercial off-the-shelf games. Okay, so one of the things that we have to be careful about when we're using commercial games in educational contexts is whether or not these commercial games have the best pedagogical outcomes, right? Because they're not necessarily designed for educational contexts, right? So some of the skepticism around using commercial games for anything other than entertainment is the idea that these in-game skills that you learn don't transfer to out-of-game context, and there is evidence that suggests this. So, for example, we have two games here, Tetris and Yoshi. These are both puzzle games that involve stacking objects, right? And so just because, you might get really good at playing Tetris and then be kind of inherently better at this game Yoshi, but, just because you're good at this kind of game doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to transfer well to an out-of-game context. And so these skills are really, really specific to that type of video game. So just stacking puzzle games, essentially. Some of the other criticism or skepticism around using commercial or entertainment games in educational context revolves around the gameplay mechanics and whether or not these gameplay mechanics do more harm than good. So one oft-cited publication is by DeHaan and colleagues using the rhythmic action game Parappa the Rapper 2, which found that students who played the game in an EFL context actually acquired less English vocabulary relative to a group of students who just watched the game. So this suggests that there was something about the interactivity of the game that was kind of interfering with the acquisition of English vocabulary. And so, this is something that we have to ask ourselves if we're using video games in educational context, of whether or not the gameplay mechanics are doing more harm than good, or whether or not, it would be better for the students to use just some kind of traditional pedagogical approach. So all this is to say that, it's not a very clear-cut scenario on whether or not we should be using video games in an educational context, right? So it's a very complicated issue. It's very multifaceted, and there's just a huge array of games that we have to choose from. And so, if we as educators are going to be using video games in educational context, we have to take really careful, we have to take care to select the game titles and genres and platforms and gameplay mechanics that most closely coincide with our curricular goals, and then specifically lead to the most desirable pedagogical outcomes. And in order to kind of accomplish this, we need to be really careful and really thorough about the data that we acquire and the data that we collect when using video games in educational contexts. And we need to use this data to not only create, but also to adapt in-class proceedings, both before, during, and after gameplay. So it's not necessarily enough to just take a game that looks like it might work well in an educational context and to sit students down in front of it and expect some kind of desirable pedagogical outcome. But rather, we should be using maybe games as one aspect of a pedagogical intervention, and we need to be designing the pedagogical intervention that around the use of that game, and be doing not just that game but other things around that game in order to kind of boost the maybe pedagogical effectiveness of using that game. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking to you about the mechanics of this game that I used in the study, which is, again, Baba Is You, and specifically why I think this game might be a good candidate to use in a grammar or syntax context, and in an EFL context in particular. So this game, Baba Is You, is a puzzle game by the creator Avri Tekari, and it utilizes individual words and an in-game grammar and syntax to form manipulable in-game rules, which then correspond to in-game objects. So, for example, we might have the sentence in this game, Baba is you. So Baba represents this in-game object, and he's like this furry white character. And then you represents the player. So when we have the sentence, Baba is you, then Baba represents your identity in that game. And then therefore you can control Baba, you can move Baba around. And you can manipulate this rule. So you can actually break the sentence down. And in so doing, you lose your identity in the game. And so actually, if you break this rule, then you can't play the game anymore. And you'd actually have to undo this action. So there has to be something in the game that represents your identity. But that's not to say that, Baba has to represent your identity in the game. So for example, you can make a new rule. For example, rock is you. And in so doing, you change the rule, and now you can move the rock around the game. And so it uses this really simple grammar form to kind of create these in-game rules, which correspond to in-game objects. But it's really simple, but the syntax of the game actually leads to really interesting grammatical structures, and actually quite complex grammar structures, specifically because you can build sentences left to right, but you can also build sentences up to down. And so you can create these really interesting structures, these interesting grammar structures. So for example, you can build the sentence Baba is you left to right, and you can build the sentence rock is Baba up to down. So you can share subjects, and you can share verbs, and you can share direct objects. And you can create these really complex grammatical structures using this syntax. And if you make the sentence rock is Baba with Baba is you, then this rock actually transforms into Baba. And now you have two Babas that you're controlling simultaneously in the game. So it's a really simple kind of gameplay mechanic, but the syntax allows you to create these really complex grammatical structures. And so it really helps you to kind of like, well, maybe not helps, it represents a really simplified version of grammar, but that you can actually manipulate in real time, and has like and is used in like a puzzle kind of context. So it leads to interesting results. And ultimately, to solve the puzzle, you have to make some kind of in-game object represent win. So if we make the sentence flag is win, then the flag is transformed into an object that you can touch in order to solve the puzzle. And so this is like a really simplified explanation of how the gameplay mechanics work. But like I said, it's a really good boiled down version of like how grammar works, and it leads to some interesting combinations, and it might help EFL students kind of think more deeply about the nuances of English language grammar and syntax. And so these are my research questions that I use to kind of form the pilot study. First and foremost, will the English language grammar or syntax puzzles featured in BaBaZu result in any kind of improvements on English word order tests that are unrelated to the game? And then, how will the game group's test scores compare to those from a control group who doesn't play the game? So this is looking, again, trying to find evidence for transferability. So does playing the game, does interacting with these grammar and syntax puzzles help you perform better on like word order questions that are unrelated to the game? And then also, again, I was interested in looking at the interaction frequency. So will higher interaction frequency with the game be correlated with better performance on these word order tests? So these are the questions that I was trying to answer. And this is how I went about measuring this. So I had 42 students who participated in the study in exchange for course credit, and the study lasted for up to 6 weeks. 16 students were in the treatment group, so this group played the game. 26 students were in the control group. These students didn't play the game, and then both groups took a word order pre-test. And if you want to take a look at these tests, you can, I have links to them in the reference section at the end of this presentation, so you can go ahead and take a look at these if you like. But these word order pre-tests are completely unrelated to the content of the game, and they also have no corrective feedback. So for example, the word order tests actually features like 8 questions, and each question has maybe about half of a sentence and then a blank. So for example, did playing games blank, and then the students are given 8 words that they have to then correctly order in order to answer the question. So in this circumstance, speak, learn, help you more fluently, to, and how. So in order to correctly answer this question, you would have to answer, did playing games help you to learn how to speak more fluently, would be the correct answer. Okay, and then so measuring interactivity with the game, so how we played the game in class. So the treatment group played the game after the pretest, and then gameplay was conducted as a class, so we played the game together. And I divided students into teams who would then compete against other teams by submitting commands to me via their smartphones. So we'd be playing the game on a big projector screen, and then the student teams would, or each student in that team would message me a suggestion or a command in order to solve the puzzle. So they might message me, flag is win, and I would perform that action. And if that command was one correct step on the road to solving the puzzle, then I would give that team 1 point. And so in so doing, the student interaction was kind of encouraged, but it was an artificial kind of way of creating competition. So the students didn't actually have to interact with the game if they didn't want to. So all they had to do in order to get project credit was to be there, essentially. But if they wanted to send me a command or a suggestion on how to solve the puzzle, then and if they were correct, then I would give that team a point. So an artificial kind of competition. And these student interactions were then tracked and then correlated to the performance on the testing protocols. And so this is how I measured the transferability by mainly through post tests. So in the meantime, the control group didn't receive any other specific instruction related to word order or syntax designed to improve test scores. Neither did the treatment group, other than playing the game. And then both groups, after 3 to 6 weeks, took 2 post tests. Post test 1, again, links are available for these tests in the references section at the end. But post test 1 is an identical test to pretest, the pretest. So looking at whether or not there was any improvement on the same test. And then post test 2 was a completely new test, same number of questions and same type of questions, but a completely different test. So again, trying to see whether or not the treatment group was able to outperform the control group on a completely new test and then a test related to the pretest. So that's how I was attempting to measure transferability of grammar skills. And these are the results that I got. So when we're looking at transferability, there wasn't actually any evidence that there was any transfer of skill going on in the treatment group relative to a control group. No significant increases were observed. And actually, if you look at all three testing protocols in both treatment and control groups, the results are almost identical. There was actually a moderately significant increase from pre-test to post-test 1 observed in the treatment group, and this was measured using a Wilcoxon signed rank test. But there was also a similar increase in the control group, not quite as big, but almost as big, and this increase in the control group wasn't statistically significant. But very similar. And I think what's going on here is not any result of the game, but actually a result of the testing effect. And the testing effect is a well-researched phenomenon in memory and cognition research, which shows that if you take a test, even without corrective feedback, and then take the same test later, that you're going to improve on it. So this kind of phenomenon. So I think that's what's going on here. And then again, if you look at post-test 2, you see that the treatment group and the control group are performing at exactly the same level. And Whitney-U tests were used for between group comparisons, and no significant differences were observed. So essentially both groups were performing at the same level. However, there was an interesting finding regarding the interaction frequency. So moderately strong significant correlations were observed between how often students interacted with the puzzles and then performance on all three testing protocols. And so that's what this is what these correlations look like. So basically, how often students attempted to solve the puzzles, or how many times they gave me a suggested command to solve the puzzle, was correlated to better performance on the word order tests. And this correlation actually strengthened from pre-test to post-test 1. And while this doesn't show causation, obviously, this does suggest that, those who were most likely to interact with the game were also the ones who are most likely to improve in their scores on the test scores. So these are the students who had the higher scores, maybe due to the testing effect or maybe not. It's difficult to say at this point, but it's an interesting correlation and that actually strengthened from pre to post test 1. And so, what this implies is, well, a number of things, but I think actually the most interesting finding is that, or this correlation between, attempted responses or attempts to solve these puzzles and then better performance on these word order tests is not actually all that surprising. So basically, you have students who are most interested in trying to solve these word order questions or these word order problems in the game were also the students who might have taken more time to kind of like think about these word order questions as well, right? So I think it's more of a behavioral kind of correlation. However, I think what really should be explored from here on out is whether we can use this kind of interaction correlation to kind of encourage or maybe even force EFL students to think more deeply about the complexities of grammar and syntax. And then, of course, whether or not this would provide any evidence of transferability. And so basically the gaming procedure used in the study allowed for voluntary interaction or inaction in the game. So students weren't forced to interact with this game at all. But I think in so doing, we kind of bypassed some of the greatest pedagogical potential of video games. So video games are really good at teaching you or are powerful learning machines because often they use this scaffolded difficulty, which kind of increases exponentially as you play through the game. So many games, the first levels are really easy to play, and they kind of teach you, some basic skills that then you need to use to interact with the game later on in more difficult contexts. And if the player is unable to accomplish these tasks, then they can't actually progress in the game. So they're required to demonstrate that they can accomplish these tasks before they can actually move on in the game. And this is a really powerful learning mechanism, one that we didn't necessarily use in this study. So I think actually by changing the study parameters and then by forcing each student to solve maybe X number of puzzles for project credit, then I think that students will at least be engaging with a form of real-time manipulable grammar, which they then have to demonstrate knowledge of in order to complete the puzzles. And this will at least give them kind of insight into, or might give them insight into, other linguistic processes in their studies of the English language. Well, while this is entirely speculative, I think this is definitely an avenue worth exploring, whether or not we can maybe utilize this kind of correlation and interaction to kind of boost maybe not necessarily knowledge of grammar, but changing how they think about grammar and helping them view grammar and the nuances of grammar and syntax in a new light. And so that's really all I have to present on right now. I'd like to open the floor up for questions and comments, and also invite you to check out this game if you would like. It's available on Steam. I have a link to the game if you would like to check it out, or if you want to contact me. I have my contact information here, and here's a list of my references if you want to take a look at those as well. Yeah, so let's go ahead and open it up for questions if you have any.
Hi, Kevin.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's a very interesting topic, and I did appreciate that you're kind of skeptical about the transferability. So I think that's an important issue. Yeah. With the pre-test and the post-tests sort of structure tests, what kinds of forms were you including? All sorts of English forms, or mainly, like, because to me it seems like that is just the game is focused pretty specifically on like a be verb kind of form. Is that
yeah so the grammar in the game is really simple, right? And it's not necessarily about it's definitely not going to like teach them any like new grammar by any means, but like I think the greatest part about the game is the complex structures that arise from the syntax. So you have to and the manipulability of like all of the grammar. So like you can actually like manipulate around it and actually see things changing in real time.
Yeah, it looks really cool game. I want to.
Yeah, it's if you like puzzle games, yeah, let me tell you, it's really fun. But it's certainly not going to teach them any like new grammar. But again, I don't think that there's probably this good transferability. But what I think might occur is that, like, in playing the game, that they're going to be thinking about grammar maybe in a new way, and slow down and like think about like word order and how word order affects like the meaning of other things. And so in the word order test, like they don't have to actually like produce any grammar. They're just they just have to correctly order the word. And what do you mean by like forms?
Oh, well, yeah, just when you said they had to reorder the words and do it in either correctly or incorrectly. Yeah, what kinds of sentences were they? All past tense or present perfect or all sorts of different things, passive forms, or was it like basically often using just like the be verb, like he is a policeman, or
no, they were a little bit more complex than that. I mean, all of them involved like the ordering of 8 different words, and so they get kind of long. Some of them are present tense, some of them are past tense, so yeah, it's kind of a mix of grammar. And so yeah, fairly straightforward sentences. Also, one of the things that I didn't talk about in the presentation, because I was trying to keep the time down a little bit, but the grading structure that I had, it wasn't like either correct or incorrect based on the position. So the grading structure that I had allowed for words to be in a different position as long as they were creating like grammatically correct sequences of words. That gave them partial credit. So they got a point for correct position, and then a point for having correct words around it, that word. So as a way to, because if you You can produce grammatically, if you have 8 words, you can produce grammatically correct sequences of words within that eight words. And so it's not entirely incorrect, but and sometimes there's not like only just one order.
Yeah, sure.
Of words. Yeah.
And did you have like a Japanese translation or anything, or was it just the English?
I had Japanese instructions.
Right. Okay.
Right. As to like, and the Japanese instructions just tell them to correctly order the sentence, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But maybe Sean might have a question.
I think we're out of time, so that's okay.
All right.
If we're out of time. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry for interrupting, but we have reached the end of the allotted time for this session. So if you have any remaining questions, please gather in the rounds to continue the discussion. Please enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to check
Take care.
everything out.
Talk to you later.
Yeah, bye-bye.
See you.